local news, Nigeria fell 4 places on the latest Corruption Perception Index, as was released on Tuesday by Transparency International. The report showed that Nigeria maintained its previous year's score of 24 out of 100 points, but fell from 150 to 154th position out of 180 countries assessed in the 2022 ranking. In previous years, Nigeria scored 26 points in 2019, 25 in the 2020 assessment, and 24 in 2021. The chairman of Transparency International, Delia Rubio, explained that global corruption levels had been stagnant for 11 years in a row. According to him, corruption has made our world a more dangerous place. As governments have collectively failed to make progress against it, they fuel the current rise in violence and conflict and endanger people everywhere. The only way out is for states to do the hard work, rooting out corruption at all levels to ensure governments work for all people, not just an elite few. Now, Rise analyst Dr. Sam Amadi joins us now to have this discussion. Good day and welcome to Newsday. I'm going to get straight into it. Now, the Civil Society Legislative Advocacy Center and Transparency International noted that the pardon granted to 2 jailed former governors, that's the former governor of Plateau State and that of Taraba State in 2022, indicated a major setback in the nation's anti-graft war. Other notable incidents include the penal regime that allowed a former controller of Nigerian Customs Services who stole 40 billion to only repay 1.4 billion naira in a plea bargain. And now this makes it seem like the war on corruption is simply rhetoric. Now, do you feel this administration had the genuine will to fight corruption in light of some of these events that transpired?
Well, I would say that this administration cannot have the genuine will and intention to fight corruption for just 2 reasons. One is that when corruption is structural, like in Nigeria, and corruption is institutionalized, like in Nigeria, you need a significant deviation from the norm. You have to be a radical government, not in terms of being revolutionary or militant or whatever, but radical in the sense that you must see the status quo as a problem. So if a regime or administration does not see the status quo as a problem and reinforces the logic and the norm of the status quo, it just can't fight corruption in a country where corruption is normative as well as structural. What I mean is simple. If you look at Nigerian political system and the organizing principle around power, around even governance, it's underlined by a strong norm of corruption, whether in terms of excluding people and rewarding others on the basis not of merit or ethical justice principles, but on the basis of relationship, loyalty. Those are issues of corruption. Now, the report by the Transparency International makes 2 points clear. The countries that have done well, the Scandinavians and some of the Singapore and all, Sweden, have one thing in common. They are countries with democracy as norm and institutions that are strong. Now, what institution simply means is actually the simple principle of merit-based, universal access. It simply means that institutions themselves regulate access to everything, not without pandering to personality, pedigree, or prerogatives. Now, Nigeria is the opposite. So, Buhari administration cannot really fight corruption because its organizing logic is actually if you like, precedentalism, meaning a sense in which they see the state as something that is owned and shared. If you look at the countries that failed, the bottom countries, there are countries that are in conflict, countries that are that authoritarian, that don't have democratic norms, and countries that are still either in some level of neo-feudal state construction, meaning we are individuals trump the system, where allocation is based on some patrimonialism or a sense in which people are entitled to something. So it's not for nothing that African countries didn't quite have a good, push forward in the rating, because most of South Africa, that's perhaps ahead of most African countries, those areas are areas where you see Rwanda, where you see a sense in which the regime itself, the administration itself, is departing from the norm. Now, they are better because institutions are still running and they're not really focusing on a strongman rule. They are not sharing access based on patrimony or pedigree or even royalty. This person is this or that. But basically, the market system, the principle of egalitarianism and the principle of merit decides allocation of resources is central to fighting corruption. So sometimes we think that corruption is a matter of anger, a matter of individual recklessness. Somebody is a strong leader. No, it's a matter of first ideology. How do you think about the state? Do you think about the state as a democratic? Do you recognize the difference between public-private, in which case every action is regulated by the principle of merit, principle of freedom and liberty? And so states that are failing in democratic rights are equally failing in anti-corruption measures. It's not just happenstance. It's connected by virtue of the concept of the state which those leaders have. It's a concept of a state that belongs to them, a state for sharing, not a state that belongs to all, where the same rules apply and where access to anything is defined by basic, open and clear rules of merit.
Thank you, Dr. Amadi.
So the Buhari government basically doesn't have those characteristics and that cannot fight corruption effectively. So it's not a matter of, oh, it happened. They just can't.
Duly noted. Thank you, Dr. Amadi. Well, although Nigeria maintained its previous year's score of 24 out of 100 points, there was a change from, in rank from 154 to 150. Just wondering if that has any significance whatsoever.
Well, the significance that some of our peers in 2021 have moved on. They have improved their rating. So we maintained our score because we've not improved anything. But we lost our position because some people have jumped ahead of us. So it is like a competitive race. We are all corrupt. That's true. But some people are picking up. If you look at Rwanda, for example, check that back there 10 years ago. You see that they have done maybe a much leap in a few years because of the changes they have brought to bear on the act of governance. So what it tells us that, yes, we are still 24 in score, but we've lost 4 places, meaning that 4 countries that we used to be better in terms of effort have done better than us. We maintain the same. It's like an exam. You score 40%, you didn't pass, but if you had 10 people who scored 40. In the next exam, you still score 40, you failed. But 4 out of the 10 people who scored 40, who scored 39 and 38 and 37, are now 50. So basically, nations that are poor, other nations that are corrupt, are doing better to improve, to reduce corruption and structurally fight corruption. But Nigeria is actually very corrupt, but at the same time, not really making strong effort or effective effort to curb corruption. So yes, we maintain our score, but more tellingly, we have actually been bypassed by other poor countries are less poor, other corrupt countries are less corrupt than we are today, and they were there was than us a year ago. They are now better than us this year. So it's regression, not just that we are stagnant. Yes, we didn't drop in points, but we regressed in the ranking of countries, showing that others did better and then we got ourselves in a worse position.
Now, Dr. Amadi, earlier you referred to strong institutions, and one naturally wants to look at the Constitution in such a case. For example, with Section 174 of the Constitution, which gives the Attorney General of the Federation the powers to take over any criminal proceedings instituted by any authority. Now, given the context that you've painted, which I don't want to call it a cultural context, but I just want to call it maybe an environmental nuance of where we are operating, do you think that we need to reassess some of the powers vested in the Constitution to reflect the nature that we've seen people exhibiting over the years?
I think I agree that we should, but again, you made a very good point. Now, if you look at this institution, people define it as if it's the ministry. Now, classically, institutions have been defined as set of rules, procedures, norms, humanly devised constraints. So take, for example, the Attorney General of the Federation. That institution is designed to prosecute to the frontline fight of corruption. Now, that institution includes the norm, includes the value system, the cultural orientation of the role occupant, the Attorney General and his staff. Now, if they use that institution to give advisory, to pardon criminals who ought to serve term, and then damnify the innocent and prosecute persons who ought to have been relieved. Now, that institution, even though it exists, is not an institution in the sense in which we're talking about strong institution. So the point then is, like, you don't want to talk about cultural, but we must have to talk about the cultural. The cultural is not just about ethnicity or religion. The cultural is the set of rules and norms and social habits that are built over time. So we need to look at a constitution and say, what kind of effective incentives and what kind of effective constraint that you need to put in place considering the reality of our society. So yes, constitutional amendment could lead to getting better institutions that are more reflective of where we are culturally. But the danger here is that we are seeing a lot of work on institutional revisionism that does not go with the very character of governance. So we talk about incentives here. For example, if you have a president, if you elect persons whose profile is that they are going to be corrupt because they came from a corrupt environment, because they play in corrupt league, and because their incentive, their wealth, everything about them is a result of corrupt undertaking, then you're going to undermine the institution. So you look at countries that have done well, that have transformed themselves. It starts with leadership. It starts with that will that uses the institutions as they exist on paper, the textual institution, and give them life, vitalize them to become tools to organize society in a different way. So I would say, yes, institutions are critical. I would say, yes, you need to amend laws and rules. But look, don't fall into legal fetishism. The notion that more laws, better rules will solve the problem if you elect to appoint or select persons who have incentive to game the system and to paralyze the effective working of those rules. So there's some kind of symbiosis here. You have to have the right people, you have to create good enough framework, legal framework, and then provide incentive for the right people to use those good enough institutions to drive change. You can get a good constitution, but if you don't get the right people, and if you don't create new expectation, social compact, people expect that, look, the leaders will be honest and transparent. And people demand for transparency and honesty. And people punish politically failure to be transparent and honest. If that doesn't happen, new constitutions may still not avail.
Well, thank you, Dr. Amadi. There were some studies, or there was a study that I found quite interesting that was done by a doctor. I'll quote him later. His name is a bit, complex. But he, according to the study, he says that he finds that there's been some doubt cast on the validity of CPI's assumptions and proposed the modified CPI, which outperforms the Transparency International's CPI. He basically said that it was also related to World Bank's control of corruption. Now, I'm just wondering if you have any issue with this tool or this means being used by Transparency International annually when it comes to measuring corruption. Do you think it's valid or it might need some work?
I think it's valid, but it has shortcomings, and I agree with the critic. First, it's related to what Claude Ake calls the correlate of a market economy. So if you look at some of the indicators there, the indicators that kind of reinforce the idea of a market-based economy. There are deeper levels of corruption, even in some of the countries that don't feature at the bottom level. So if you look at how lobbying, some of the legitimized way in which elite groups capture public policy and use public policy to drive returns for themselves and impoverish the people. Arguably, one can argue that these perception index do not cover some of these more entrenched and legitimized form of corruption. That's a critique. Again, we can also say this is about perception. In fact, I think that Nigeria is more corrupt than the perception index throws up, because primarily, if you look at the fact that most of the rules that we play on National Assembly, their public hearings, their private, yesterday they met with the governor of Central Bank behind doors. Those kind of meetings are those structural ways in which decisions are made in this country. suggests deep-seated corruption. It's not a matter of exchange of money or bribery. It's also a fact that policies are captured easily and used blatantly to provide benefit for some people against others. So I would argue, I would support the view that the transparency approach and methodology might not be rigorous enough to capture some of these other layers of corruption that the neoliberal market economy and democracy as we see today kind of, they are happy to live with. But again, better this than nothing. This CPI helps us to also see how we can gain some foothold, and then we can deepen the fight against corruption and maybe move beyond the constraints of the neoliberal paradigm. But we are failing. If we are failing on the simpler neoliberal paradigm, we would definitely fail on the much more rigorous structural paradigm. So I would go with the CPIs, and maybe we do better after we have gained, like Sweden, like Finland, maybe even as close as Germany or others countries that are doing fairly well. Then we can talk about how do we supersede and deepen get a more accountable, honest, and truly welfare improving government. But for now, let's stay with the CPI of the Transparency International. They are good enough to move us to see how bad we are and how well, how much we need to travel and do to get to even a realistically fair society.
And in doing so, I agree with you. It's certainly a process, and we're trying to get a foothold on corruption, as you said. Now, I just want to play devil's advocate for a moment. Some people will say that what we've seen during this administration is more than we've ever seen, and that as much as there may have been a semblance of catch and release, at least we got to see official publication, and we got to see some of these cases having their day in court, and the Nigerian people got to appreciate the depth and the gravity of the situation in real black and white, in facts and figures and numbers. Do you think that history will judge this administration kindly for their effort that they've made? Yes, corruption may have not been destroyed. However, truly exposing it in the way that it has been surely should be considered as a step in the right direction.
I think it's a matter of choosing between outcome and outputs. Okay, so there's this crisis of the paradox of evaluation. So you're going to look at how many cases have we filed to court, how many convictions have we got. So if you look at that outputs, you could say, oh, this administration is done better than that, and so on and so forth. Now you look at outcome in terms of saying what has changed, you may have a difference. So it depends on what they're looking at. But again, to be fair to this government, my quarrel with the government is that the basic things that need to be done. Okay, let's start with constituting government. Now, a corrupt country, when a government comes into power on the basis of fighting corruption, the first test is who you bring to government. So President Buhari's signal failure was to bring back the criminals, quote unquote, or the corrupt persons back to government. So how are you going to solve that problem? So first, signaling, you have confused this, you have sent the wrong signals that the government intends to fight corruption. Second, we saw at the initial stage very blatant violation of procedures and rules. I mean, the biggest for me was removing the Chief Justice of Nigeria on the basis of ex parte by a corrupt administrative tribunal itself. I mean, so there are certain things that this administration did that compromise fundamentally. Look at macroeconomic policy making, even the monetary policy, the issues around them from day one. Look at the allegations against the Secretary of Government. So there are certain corruption events that totally eclipse everything you do. You don't want to have people who are closely working with the president being cited, even if not proved in court, for corruption. You don't want to see the Accountant General of the Federation standing trial for 190 billion naira in corruption. Those kind of swarm out the cases you win in court because it tells a story that even the government itself is not in a position to signal to citizens that this is a new beginning. So that's, for me, is where we lost it. Yes, we may see more prosecutions by number, who knows, It could be evidence of more corruption. It could be evidence that the cases that have been on in the pipeline get closed in this administration. It's a case of, for example, a different government starts road network, a different government finishes it and takes the bragging right of commissioning the roads. But the work has been a continuous work.
Thank you.
I will not give this the administration kudos because they muddled the waters and didn't give good enough clear signal.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sam Amadi, Arise News analyst.